Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in today. Hang on. Okay, so here we go. We're going to try this again. Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in today. Unfortunately, I keep losing my intro, but I'm going to find it again. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, the Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books, I want to welcome you to a virtual evening with Nancy Pearl and Jeff Schwager to discuss The Writer's Library, the authors you love on the books that changed their lives, published by our friends at Harper One. A love letter to books and a celebration of wordsmiths, The Writer's Library is a treasure for anyone who has been moved by the written word. With a foreword by Susan Orlean, 23 of today's living literary legends reveal the books that made them think, brought them joy, and changed their lives. Nancy Pearl regularly speaks about the importance and pleasure of reading at libraries, literacy organizations, and community groups around the world. She can be found on NPR's Morning Edition and KWGS-FM in Tulsa, Oklahoma, talking about her favorite books. Her monthly television show, Book Lust with Nancy Pearl, features interviews with authors, poets, and other literary figures. Among her many honors are the 2011 Librarian of the Year from Library Journal and the 2011 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association. Nancy is first and foremost a reader who has spent her life promoting reading as one of the most beneficial and joyful experiences anyone can have. Jeff Schwager is a Seattle-based journalist and playwright. Book It Repertory Theater produced his adaptation of Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson in 2013. The following year, the company's 5-hour stage version of his adaptation of Michael Chabon's The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay won Theater Puget Sound's Gregory Award for Outstanding Production. He lives on Queen Anne Hill in a craftsman house built in 1913 with his partner, Megan, and his pug, Edgar. We'll have some time to take some questions from the audience after our talk, so please go ahead and put in your questions anytime during the broadcast in the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. I'll also take a moment to remind you that you can order your copy of The Writer's Library from Books and Books Below by pressing the green button at the bottom of the screen. Every purchase you make keeps Books and Books up and running, so don't hold back. You can also press the donate button anytime, and any amount is welcome. Indie bookstores need your help now more than ever, so we're particularly grateful that Nancy and Jeff had made time to be with us today. And now, I want to welcome our guest to the stage. I want to warn you, we've had some technical issues getting here. So let's see what happens. Hello?
Good evening.
We still have some of those issues happening. Better? Nancy?
Better.
No? No. I am so sorry. I want to apologize to everyone out there. I'm not quite sure what we can do, with the exception of trying one more time to bring you guys, to toggle you off and bring you and prompt you back in. Okay? Do you want to? Okay, let's try that one more time.
Sure.
Again, apologies for let's see. What is going on?
Christina?
Yes.
Let me change Wi-Fi providers quickly.
Okay.
See if that helps.
Are you on Chrome?
I am on Chrome. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to close you out again, okay? Or are you going to do that automatically? How's it going?
I don't know. Maybe Jeff needs to do this by himself.
Can I ask you something? You don't have any other tabs open on your computer, and no speakers are on or anything like that. Okay. Oh my gosh.
So the noise on...
Yes, it's like a reverberation. Yes, I hear it. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Shoot. Want to try one more time wearing headphones?
Sure.
I'm going to re-prompt you. Sorry, everyone. Hi.
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 Can you hear me?
I can. Now we're waiting for Jeff. So everyone is still with us here because I can see you. Hi, Jeff. I'm afraid. Jeff.
Hello.
Okay.
You sound fine to me. How do I sound to you?
I think we got it.
Okay.
Okay. So let's do this thing. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. So I want to start by asking you, how did you guys meet? And where did the idea for this book come from?
Well, that's Jeff's question. So I'm going to let him answer.
Well, we met at the Washington State Jewish Historical Society, where I was curating a project called Agents of Change, 20 Remarkable Jewish Women of Washington State. And Nancy was one of the women we were honoring. And so I interviewed her, and we hit it off, which is very rare in an interview that you hit it off with somebody and you start socializing with them, at least in my experience. But we started hanging out and having lunch and talking about books. And after a certain amount of time, when I felt really comfortable with Nancy and sure that it wouldn't in any way jeopardize our friendship, I told her that I had this idea for a book called The Writer's Library, and that I thought it would be really cool if she worked on it with me. And my idea was to do a coffee table book where we would go and interview writers, but also someone would come and take pictures of their actual libraries. And the book that would come out of it would feature both interviews and photos. Nancy felt like she didn't really want to do a coffee table book, that she wasn't a coffee table book person, but that she would be interested in doing an interview book. And I said, you know, that would be great too. I really don't care one way or the other. I just want to hang out with you and go interview authors and go to their homes. And so that's kind of the idea that we took to Nancy's agent, and I'll let Nancy take it from there.
And my agent, Victoria Sanders, said no to the coffee table book. She said, it's not your brand, Nancy, but a book of interviews would be great.
So what was it like traveling around the country and visiting these authors? Can you share some stories?
It was really great. It was, every interview was different from every other interview. We didn't go in to any of the interviews with a set list of questions. We usually began with me saying something like, did you grow up in a reading family? Were your parents readers? But after that, we just let the conversation go wherever the writer wanted it to. And it was pretty spectacular where the writers wanted us to go with them.
And how much time did you spend with each writer?
You know, the writers were enormously generous with their time. And if it wasn't for me kicking Jeff under the table to try to get him to stop talking, we'd probably still be there talking to Tom Boyle and Siri Hustvedt and Russell Banks.
Fascinating. There's fascinating people. They're just fascinating. Oh my gosh.
So normally, I think we got about 2 hours of recording. Don't you think, Jeff?
Yeah, anywhere from 90 minutes to 2 hours. And if we hit the 2 hour mark, Nancy would start kicking me or elbowing me, depending on which of her limbs was working and was closest to me. But yeah.
So what were the homes like? The homes of these authors? Like, did they let you into like their secret libraries? Did they like share all of their books with you? Were you able to hold them? You know, share some of those like wonderful stories for book lovers like us.
Well, Jeff, why don't you?
Yeah, they were great. The first one that immediately jumps out is T.C. Boyle's home, which is a Frank Lloyd Wright designed home it was the first Frank Lloyd Wright designed prairie style home west of the Mississippi. And it's in Montecito, California. He lives across the street from the country club and right down the road from Oprah Winfrey in Montecito, which is a beautiful town right outside of Santa Barbara. It's a beautiful home, and he set out a little picnic for us and showed it. You know, after the sort of early part of the interview, we started following him around his house to the different rooms where he had his books, and it was just a wonderful experience to talk to him about the books on his shelves. And many of the writers were like that. Jennifer Egan lives in a 4-story house in Brooklyn. And we kind of followed her up the winding staircase. And on each floor, she kind of has a different kind of book. On the second floor were the books that were related to each of her novels. So one bookshelf has all the books that she used to research her last book, Manhattan Beach. And another bookshelf was the books that she used to research A Visit from the Goon Squad. On the next floor, there were a lot of children's books from when her kids were growing up. And on the top floor were her books in many different languages, which were actually spread out on the floor because she was having her assistant go through them to give them away to local charities and libraries. So that's, those were two amazing homes we got to see on opposite coasts. Jane Hirschfield, the poet, has this beautiful garden, and she writes a lot about gardens and plants and fruit trees in her poems. So it was amazing to see the garden that inspires so much of her work. And then she has a writing room. It's a separate structure where all her poetry books are in addition to her writing space. And we got to go in there and see floor-to-ceiling books of poems, which was amazing.
And don't forget...
Michael Chabon. Oh, go ahead, yeah.
I was going to say, don't forget Amor Towles, because
oh, yes.
we loved that.
Yes, Amor has this beautiful home in New York City, and he has this library that is just the classic writer's library with a beautiful desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves in high-ceilinged rooms on all the walls. And here comes our UFO again. And first editions behind glass from the 19th century and signed books. And one thing that I really loved was Amor Towles, like myself, is a big Bob Dylan fan, and so he had one shelf of all Bob Dylan books that I really liked seeing and comparing with my own shelf of Bob Dylan books. And Michael Chabon, we only got to see some of his books, but we did hang out in his kitchen, where he and his wife Violet Waldman were eating peanut butter and banana sandwiches while Nancy and I drank tea, which we did in pretty much every interview. Nancy and I people gave us tea at every interview. We're both tea drinkers.
We were offered a sandwich by Michael and I.
Nancy?
Yes.
Are you there? Okay.
I am.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is try to maybe, like Jeff, I'm just going to turn your microphone off when Nancy speaks, because I think it helps, that reverberation. But
Okay.
you guys can just take turns. So can you tell me, like, did any of the books the authors mentioned, like, really surprise you?
Yes. Many of the authors, more than you would ever believe, talked about how important Watership Down by Richard Adams was to them.
That is so interesting. Wow.
And this was a book
It's one
published
of mine.
in
It's a favorite book of mine as well. Yes.
Really?
Yes. Very significant. When
the next time Madeline Miller comes to Books and Books, you have got to talk to her about that.
Oh my God.
She read it, so it was published in 1972, and she read it when she was really getting into Greek and Latin, and the mythology. And so she read it as though it were a heroic tale. And she describes reading the last 100 pages in this state of just heightened awareness. And it was amazing.
Did she tell you how old she was when she read it?
I think she was 11 or 12.
Okay, yeah, because I remember being in school also.
Yes.
Just having it impressed me so much, especially because it's about animals. And, of course, I'm an animal lover, but yeah. And Madeline Miller, oh my God, is she impressive or what?
Yes. Oh, and just a lovely, lovely person.
Lovely, so smart, whip smart, and so talented. We hosted her for Circe.
Yeah,
another book that is fantastic, and she was delightful.
I interviewed her for Circe.
So now I'm going to ask you, Jeff, what was your surprise?
Oh gosh, biggest surprise. Well, I was very surprised how many of the writers were into science fiction, I guess, is what I would say. I always imagine the world and young people especially divided equally between science fiction and mystery fans. And I think what I found was that there were many, many more science fiction fans than mystery fans when they were young. As they got older, I think many of them became mystery fans. But so, for example, Dave Eggers, who's not at all a science fiction writer, the first book that really influenced him was Dune. He read it when he was in school, and it just blew his mind. And he said he was like living in Dune for the whole time he was reading the book, and that when he finished the book, he was stumbling through the halls of his school in a just haze from that experience. So that was
another great book.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, but certainly the Watership Down was a surprise. Michael Chabon and Andrew Sean Greer were two other writers who loved Watership Down. And I guess I had always associated Watership Down as more of a girl's book, so I was a little surprised that they were such fans of it. And my own reading as a kid, I think I was very much viewed books in a segregated way, which is probably no longer relevant, I hope.
Well, now
it seems like I missed out.
Well, now that we're on, so what are books? Could you each share a book that was formative in your own reading life?
Well, one of the collection of books, or an author who was very formative to me, was a writer who published in the late 40s, 50s, early 60s, what we now would call teenage fiction. A writer named Mary Stolz, Stolz. And she wrote several books for younger children, one of which was a Newbery, not an award winner, but a finalist. But her teenage novels, which I devoured, and I own all of them, are written in a kind of stream of consciousness, which you just don't get books for teens written in that style. And you know, she was wonderful at creating her characters. And for me, her books really defined not only the kinds of books I still like, which are wonderfully written books with three-dimensional characters, but when I wrote my novel George and Lizzie, it's nothing like Mary Stolz's books, and it's not written in stream of consciousness, but it shares something of the honesty, I think, and truth of Mary Stolz's novels.
What about you, Jeff?
I would say that the writer who most influenced me formatively was F. Scott Fitzgerald. I remember sitting home alone in Santa Monica, where I was raised, on a rainy afternoon, and it didn't rain much in Santa Monica, and pulling a book off the shelf, Babylon Revisited and Other Short Stories by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and opening it to a story called Winter Dreams. And just being blown away, it was my first exposure to Fitzgerald, and just being blown away by the beauty of the language and the intimacy of the voice. On the one hand, the language is elevated, but on the other hand, it just felt like he was talking to the reader. And that story in particular is kind of a run through for what he goes after in The Great Gatsby. It's about a young man and his first love with a young girl, and how that eventually breaks apart and influences his whole life in the same way that Gatsby's love for Daisy influences Gatsby's life. And after I read that story, I read the whole book. There's a story in there called The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, which is kind of a fantasy story, and it was perhaps my first exposure to fantasy literature. Before that, I was a very big mystery fan, but not a science fiction or fantasy fan at all. And so I really loved that story. And eventually, after I finished that book, I read The Great Gatsby. I read Tender as the Night. And again, those stories, the beauty of the language more than anything, really started me loving literature as something that up until then I was a big music fan. And there's a musicality to Fitzgerald's language that really appealed to me. And it was like listening to somebody singing to me almost as I read those books and heard them in my head. So he was really the one for me.
We hosted Carl Hyacin and Nick Hornby yesterday, and they were talking about how important music is to both of them, as they write, actually, and they were sharing some of their playlists. So did you walk away with any titles added to your TBR pile?
Yeah, the first one came from the first interview with Jonathan Lethem, where he and Nancy started talking about this book that I had never heard of. As I say, I grew up in the LA area, and it was an LA book called The Nowhere City by Alison Lurie. And it wasn't a book I was familiar with at all, which surprised me because I've made a point of reading LA books all my life. And so I immediately got a copy of that and read it and loved it. So that was the first book. And along the way, I think every interview I came away with books that not necessarily that I hadn't heard of, but that I had not read, and thought, wow, this person's passion for that book really makes me want to read it. And I think that's the effect that we're hoping that the book will have on people, that as people hear about the passion that their favorite writers they respect have for specific books, that they'll want to read those books, and that it'll expand everyone's TBR list and everyone's joy of reading.
So how did the authors say that their reading habits changed when they were working on a book, if they changed at all? Did you talk about that a little bit with them?
Yeah, we did. What was interesting is that many of the writers talked about the books that they read, not even just when they were writing, but certainly when they were working on a new book. The books they chose to read were books that they felt would help them with their writing. So Laurie Frankel, for example, talked about keeping a book open on her lap and working on her new book. Russell Banks talked about how the new book, he has a new novel coming out either later this year or early 2021. He reread The Death of Ivan Ilyich because he thought that there was something in that, the way Tolstoy handled the story, that he could learn from. So, I mean, I'm somebody who just reads because of the joy of it, because of the pleasure of it. And I don't read because I want to learn from the way the writers are doing, or what they're doing. So that was really, really interesting to me. And Andy Greer talked about how if he reads a book, if he starts a book that doesn't seem like it's helping with his new project, he stops reading it. So that kind of example, I think, was really, really interesting.
Our motto at Books and Books is a quote from Borges, and it's, "I cannot sleep unless I'm surrounded by books." And I guess it would be interesting just to talk about, what is it about being surrounded by books? What is it about creating your own personal library, curating the voices that are in it. What is it about it that just has the capacity to change your life and make it so meaningful and special?
Well, don't you think part of it is that when you're surrounded by books, you're not alone? It's so, books are so expansive, and books allow you to experience things you wouldn't ordinarily experience, to meet people that you're not going to meet, to do things that you're not likely to do. I think it's that expansiveness, that sense of sharing, the beauty of the language, which is so important to me. I think that's why Jeff and I both love poetry, for example.
Yeah, and every book I think is, full of memories for the reader. And it's, every time you glance at it on your shelf, you're remembering all the things that you experienced with the author.
That's it.
And it's, I can't bear to part with books. I mean, Nancy, of course, has sent hundreds of books every month, and so she has no choice but to get rid of books from time to time. But I, on the other hand, get a few books every month and can't bear to part with them. And my house is just overrun with books. I mean, it's a nightmare. And my wife is none too pleased about it. But every one of the books that I have is either full of memories for me, or it's like a place it's a trip I'm gonna take, and I'm looking forward to it. And I'm looking forward to the experience I'm going to have.
But sometimes those memories are false.
Of course.
We had an interesting discussion with Richard Ford. And we were talking about the book The Moviegoer by Walker Percy, which he had used at a class he was teaching at the University of Michigan. And I read The Moviegoer when I was about 18, and I loved it. It was one of those seminal novels. The main female character, was about my age. She was severely depressed. I was severely depressed. I kind of conflated the two of us, and it was so meaningful to me. I mean, it was a wonderful book. And then, 40 years later, I went back because I was going to use it to teach a class that I was teaching to librarians. And I reread it, and I had no connection with it any longer. I wasn't 18. I wasn't depressed. It didn't have the same connection for me. And that's sad. That's sad, because it's a book that turned into something so different from how I first experienced it. Where, of course, I was the person who turned into somebody that I wasn't when I first read it.
It's interesting. Another writer who had a similar experience was Susan Choi with the Chronicles of Narnia, which was a book she loved when she was a kid, and she wanted to introduce it to her kids. And so she went back and reread it, and she said she was encountering ideas that she now, in the current environment, found racially insensitive, if not racist. This idea of that the dark people in the book are all the villains, and the blonde-haired people are all the heroes, and the to Narnia in the north is sort of the catchphrase, and that it's people in the north, the light-skinned people, who are the good people, and the people in the south are the dark-skinned people and the bad people. And she felt it was not a book she wanted to share with her kids. So it's, I guess, the lesson between both Susan and Nancy's experiences is be careful about what you reread. Make sure you're gonna still be able to connect with it.
Sometimes it's better just to hold like the memory
Right.
of the initial impact of the narrative, I guess, in your life.
Right.
Like, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret.
Right.
I haven't reread that, but it was so important to me. I actually snuck it out of the library, and read it as a young girl. And, and now, of course, Judy Blume co-owns one of our Books and Books stores in Key West. So I met her many, many years later and was just like, the adulation that you feel for people like that they just like, they speak to you directly and they change your world. But sometimes you do outgrow or just change.
Right.
So can you talk to us a little bit about just the diversity of voices now? Do you see that that our landscape is changing? Can you talk a little bit about like the Western male canon versus everything that's happening now with new authors and new voices being introduced into the mix?
Jeff, as a representative of the white male canon?
Yes. Well, certainly with this book, it was our goal to represent the America that we see today, and not represent just the white male canon. That was one of the things that Nancy and I went into the book explicitly setting out to do. We decided at an early point in the project to only interview American writers, but we wanted it to be American writers, some who were refugees, like Viet Thanh Nguyen and Maza Mengiste, some who were immigrants, like Laila Lalami. Luis Alberto Arreo was born almost literally straddling the US-Mexican border. He was born in Tijuana. When he was very young, he moved to San Diego, and his parents had a kind of what he described as a tug of war over his soul, almost, whether he would be Mexican or American. And one of the ways that they did that was through what he read. That his father wanted him to read in Spanish, his mother wanted him to read in English. And he experienced discrimination growing up in San Diego as someone who was, with a Mexican name. But he really fell in love with American literature. He tells us about, the first erotic experience of his life was reading Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. And there's a scene where Becky gives Tom a piece of gum she's been chewing for him to chew. And that was a real turn on for him. And he was like blown away by that. And so, yeah, we did want to definitely get away from the classical white male canon. On the other hand, there are certainly plenty of white male writers represented in the book. You can't get away from the fact that there are many great white male authors and white female authors out there too, and we certainly didn't want to exclude them on those grounds. So the ones who are our favorites are very much represented in the book. People like Amor Towles, Richard Ford, Siri Hustvedt, Venda Levita. Go ahead, Nancy. You can add more. But
Jennifer Egan, Donna Tartt. But I think talking to, for example, Laila Lalami about growing up in Morocco when it was still part of France, and what that was like for her and for others like her. I think it gives the book a depth. when the book was published, we sent copies to all the authors, and we got a note back from Jonathan Lethem, who said that he had just read the interview we did with him, and he really thought it captured, in a way that other interviews hadn't, it really captured who he was, because we weren't talking specifically about these writers as writers, we were talking about them as readers. And Jeff and I went into the interviews thinking, hoping that it would be just a conversation among readers, which it turned out to be.
Your mic's muted.
What was the process of compiling the interviews and transcribing them? What was that like? And how did you, what did you choose to keep in? How was that process?
Well, Jeff and I started by each making a list of authors that we would want to interview. And the ones that were on both our lists were who we were going to ask first. And then I like to say that it didn't come to fisticuffs, and voices were not necessarily raised in anger, but we did have some good discussions about who we should include. And the transcription, so we recorded these interviews, and so we had 90 minutes to 2 hours of us talking to a particular author. And we used a transcription app to turn the sound into words on the screen. And then we were going to go and work with that. But I have to say, I for one found that transcription so hard that if we had to go on and do it ourselves, the book never would have been. So luckily, we live in a city where there are a lot of readers, and we found a young woman who worked at one of the bookstores in Seattle, Finney Books, and she luckily agreed to do the transcription. And Jeff, why don't you talk about how we then edited each interview?
Yeah, well, to begin with, we lucked out with this woman, Annika, because she's a charter member of the Nancy Pearl fan club. So she was eager to do it because she loves Nancy's work so much. Once we had the transcript from Annika, one of us would go through it and edit it for sort of content and length. And we didn't have any set ideas about things we wanted to cover. I mean, as with the interviews, we let we followed them where they went and kept what we found most interesting and took out what we found most common, I guess, in a way that wasn't interesting. If people gave us the exact answer that you would expect them to give, then that's not something that we wanted to keep in. Once one of us had edited the interview and hopefully gotten it down from, say, 20,000 words to 10,000 words, then the other person would then try to get it down to 5,000 words. I mean, that was sort of the average length, I would say, is 5,000 words per interview. It was just a matter of continual cutting, trying to get them down. The interviews range anywhere from, I think, 3,000 to 7,000 words. It was an arduous but not an unenjoyable process where we got to really dig in and shape the interviews. And then we would send them back to the writers and ask them if they would like to revise anything, if they'd like to add anything, if they felt that the interviews represented what they wanted to say. Because this isn't journalism. We weren't out to scoop anything. We were out to really give a representation of who these people were as readers. And so there were no ethical issues about allowing them to collaborate in the process. And that was, you know, we got a lot out of some of the writers in that way. Some of them were really interested in working on revisions, refining the language, and others were not. One of the most interesting interviews in that regard was Michael Chabon and Ayelet Waldman, who were married, and we interviewed them jointly and sent the interview to them to each review. And Ayelet rewrote some of her parts, and Michael didn't, as far as we know, even look at it. He's a guy who's done a million interviews and is incredibly confident in who he is as a writer and who he is as a person, and he felt like whatever he said was fine with him. And Ayelet, on the other hand, is a lawyer by training, and she went to Harvard Law School, and she wanted to say very specific things, and so she edited her interviews. And so that was an interesting process throughout to see who would edit them and who wouldn't, and what they would do with the edited pieces. So, yeah.
So are there any books mentioned that you would specifically recommend as an escape from these times? Or any titles that you yourselves would recommend for the times that we're going through?
So one of the things that we haven't really touched on was how exciting it was to find some of our favorite books on writers' shelves and know that they were some of their favorite books. But mostly those books I couldn't recommend as escapist books. But I just finished the new novel by Naomi Novik. It's called A Deadly Education. And I think really this is the next great YA fantasy for adults as well. It's a brilliant world building, a wonderful main character, a young woman, Galadriel. And, you know, I can't wait for the sequel. So reading that, I'm not here. I'm in that world that Naomi Novik has created.
And I'll add two books that I would recommend during this time. One of them is by an author who's represented in the book, Amor Towles, A Gentleman in Moscow, which on the one hand is a great escape from this era. It takes place from the Russian Revolution into the 1950s and around the time Stalin dies. But it's also, in a way, a lesson in how to survive during lockdown. It's about a man who is forced to live in a hotel for 50 years. And if he steps outside, he'll be executed. And he makes the best of it. And it's the most charming book, an amazing voice, just beautifully written, just enchanting. Love that book. And the other book that I'll recommend for anybody who is looking for an absolute escape from these times is a book that Nancy and I both love, Lonesome Dove by Larry Mcmurtry, which takes you back to the Old West, completely different world than the world we're living in now. The world couldn't be more wide open than the world we're living in now. You know, the plains are open. People can travel wherever they want. The dangers that the people are facing are nothing like the dangers that we all face now, but they are very serious dangers. And beautifully written again, just a masterpiece. that's, I believe, 900 pages, and you can't put it down. I mean,
that's such a great.
Yeah, just one of the great reading experiences of anyone's life who's read it, I think.
Such a great book, and such a great miniseries too. That's an example of a work that was well adapted, and that's a whole other subject.
Yes.
What is done to these books that we love, you know?
Right.
Yes.
On film.
In fact, A Gentleman in Moscow is about to be adapted with Kenneth Branagh playing Count Rostov, and I'm really interested to see what they do with that, because I do love the book so much, and I'm scared for the book, and at the same time I love Kenneth Branagh, so the idea of seeing him as the Count is really appealing. And that also reminds me that Good Lord Bird just debuted, I believe, on Showtime with Ethan Hawke as John Brown, and I'm very curious to see what becomes of that as a miniseries.
And he was somebody we would have liked to have interviewed. He was on our list.
So do you think you'll do a volume 2?
Well, you know, one of the great pleasures of the Writers' Library is that we got to see the writers and interact with them face to face. So it, from what we've been hearing, readers feel like they're there too. And I don't, much as I would like to continue, I don't want to do a Zoom interview. I just don't think that it would have the same feel. And that feeling, I think, is really important.
That said, we are hoping that, as everyone is, that it will be possible to travel again sometime within the next couple of years. And when that time comes, you know, we'd love to do another book, and we'd love to get to interview many of the writers who we didn't get to interview the first time.
I would love, we could only interview one poet, and I would love to interview more poets. We wanted to interview a playwright, and everybody that we asked had other commitments and couldn't do it at that time.
Yeah, it was interesting with playwrights. They were all working on productions of their plays, so they couldn't take the time away from rehearsals to do the interviews. And our standards were very high. Pretty much only Pulitzer Prize winning playwrights we were talking to, so they were all incredibly busy.
It's a great time for books also to be adapted, made into films, into television series. I mean, there's just this great thirst for content. So that's a wonderful thing, is that you're seeing more and more of these projects, you know, around books. So that's, you know, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. And here is one. I think you may have covered some of this already, but how did you decide who to interview? And are there authors that you wanted to interview?
We really wanted, the answer to the second half of that question is yes, definitely. Jeff wanted to interview many white male writers who happened to be dead. So that was a little bit of an issue. But we really wanted to interview Lori Moore. She's somebody that we have a huge, we both love, and just would love to interview her. Toni Morrison, we really wanted to interview, but she was ill. And Alice Munro, another writer that both Jeff and I really admire, has seemingly retired, which she certainly has the the age and the gravitas and the right to do. So, but we were very sorry that we weren't able to interview them.
Yeah, and there were some writers who agreed to be interviewed that we were not able to arrange interviews with. One of them was Tobias Wolff, who was in the middle of finishing a book, and by the time that he was available, we had already turned in our manuscript. Edwidge Danticat was somebody we really wanted to interview, and she was out on book tour when we were in New York, and then she was going to be in Florida, actually, when the second time we went to New York, so we couldn't arrange an interview with her. Yeah, I mean, there's a long list of people that we really wanted to interview and would love to interview if we do another one. Somebody I really wanted to interview was Blake Bailey, the biographer of Richard Yates and John Cheever, and who is the biographer of Philip Roth. His Philip Roth biography is coming out next year. And I thought it would be interesting to talk to him about not only the books that he's read, but also the books that the people that he's written biographies of read, which he would certainly know about. So those were some of the people that really we were eager to interview. And Zadie Smith was not available. She's somebody I would have loved to interview. On Beauty is such a wonderful book. I mean, I could go on and on about people that I would love to talk to.
Yeah, I think that would be the hardest part, is just deciding which ones. There's so many wonderful writers out there.
Well, and we're going to, as I said, we'd like to open the second volume up to non-American writers. So people like Salman Rushdie and Ian McEwan and Michael Ondaatje are, amazing writers we'd love to interview overseas. Jeanette Winterson is somebody I think we all admire and we'd like to interview. So, if we're able to do a second volume, if we're able to open it up, I think we'll be able to interview some just amazing writers that will keep the standard as high as it is. I think it would be hard to top the standard that we established with the first book, but I don't think we would have to lower the standard for volume 2.
So, what is your hope for the book? What do you want people to take from it?
Well, I'm a librarian and a former bookseller, and I would like people to meet, through reading the book, authors that they weren't familiar with, and not only read those authors' books, but also the books that author has recommended, has talked about. I got a text from my cousin who said she was just horrified that she really only knew the work of 7 of the 23 writers in the book, and she considered herself a reader. And I think that's wonderful, because I think our goal has always been to just broaden the interests, broaden the world of the readers of the writer's library.
And I would add to that I hope that people get so lost in reading the interviews that they forget that they're not actually taking part in these conversations, that they feel like they're at the table with us. They've met these writers. They've talked to these writers about books. They know these writers through their reading and have enjoyed that experience as much as Nancy and I did, because it really was a beautiful experience to get to talk to all these people we admire so much about the thing that we care about so much. And I hope the readers feel the same way.
Well, we've been chatting for an hour now and have somewhat defeated our technical difficulties. And I just want to thank you both for your persistence and fighting spirit and for rolling with all of this. I want to remind viewers that you can order the book if you haven't already. You can order it by just pressing the green button at the bottom of the screen. There it is, beautiful. And we will ship it right out to you immediately. If you want to pass by, if you're in Miami, you want to pass by one of our stores, we also have it stocked at our stores. So we have safe shopping, and we also have curbside pickup if you'd like to do that. And then I just want to thank everyone for watching tonight and for talking about these things that we love called books. And on behalf of Books and Books and Miami Book Fair and all of us here at Books and Books, I want to thank you both very much. And I hope that we will see you in person when all of this is over. And we'll be out in the courtyard talking books. And I really hope that happens soon. And until then, keep doing the wonderful work that you do. And please keep in touch with us and let us know how the book is doing, how you're progressing. We're going to be recommending it, selling it at all of our stores. And I thank you both for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Christina.
Thanks.
It was great.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Take good care.